Should I start my speech? Okay. Now, this is not a speech about free software. This is a speech about a follow-on question people used to ask at the end of my speeches about free software. Do these ideas apply to anything else? But as an introduction, I better say something to explain what free software is all about. Free software means software that respects the user's freedom. It does not mean zero-price software. It's not an issue of price at all. It's about how the developer treats the users. So I say, think of free speech, not free beer. In Polish, it's clearer. You can say wolny, and people will know you don't mean zero-price software. They might get confused in another way, but it's not such a dangerous confusion. Non-free software, proprietary software, keeps the users divided and helpless. Divided because they are forbidden to share, and helpless because they don't have the source code, so they can't change the program. They can't even study what it's really doing. But free software respects the user's freedom and respects the social solidarity of the user's community. What does this mean? It's very easy to say, I'm in favor of freedom, but that's so vague in general, it's not much of a statement. Even Bush says he's in favor of freedom. Doesn't recognize freedom even after he's crushed it. So I had better say something more specific. Free software means the user has 4 essential freedoms. So if you have these freedoms, the program is free software, at least for you. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and then change it to make the program do what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. That's the freedom to make exact copies and distribute them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, which is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions, if you have made any, when you wish. So, if you have these 4 freedoms, the social system of the program's distribution and use is an ethical system, one that respects freedom and social solidarity, and so we call this free software. But if one of these freedoms is missing or is insufficient, then the social system of the program's distribution and use is an unjust system, and that's what makes it proprietary software. So the distinction between free and proprietary software is not a technical question at all. It's an ethical and social question. Whether the developers have taken away the user's freedom. Because a non-free program gives the developer unjust power over the users, its existence is a social problem. So the goal of the free software movement is to put an end to this problem, to eliminate proprietary software. And what we seek to do is to teach people to recognize how a proprietary program is an attack on your freedom, so that you will know better than to tolerate it in your computer, so that you will reject it, so that you will insist on your freedom and defend your freedom and use free software as a way of keeping your freedom. And thus, if you have a choice to develop, well, I should say, I'm in favor of encouraging people to do things that contribute to society, and I want to discourage activities that hurt society. Thus, I want to encourage people to develop free software, and I want to discourage the development of proprietary software. Because every proprietary program, in effect, is a trap, inviting users to surrender their freedom in order to use the program. So developing a free program makes the world a better place, more or less depending on how it works. But, you know, some programs make a big contribution and some make hardly any. But basically, you're behaving ethically if you release a free program. But to release a proprietary program is not a contribution to society, it's a power grab. And this should be discouraged and impeded. So if you have a chance, if you have a choice to either develop a proprietary program or do something else and not develop any program, it's better if you don't develop any program. At least then you are doing no harm. Now, this might strike you as controversial, so let me briefly mention the reasons why these freedoms are essential. Freedom 2, the freedom to help your neighbor, the freedom to distribute exact copies of the program is essential on fundamental moral grounds, so you can live an ethical, upright life as a good member of your community. If you use a program without freedom 2, then you are in danger of falling into a moral dilemma. It can happen at any moment. Whenever your friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" In that moment, you will face a choice between two evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to deny your friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. Being in the dilemma, you ought to choose the lesser evil, which is to give your friend a copy. What makes this the lesser evil? Well, if you can't avoid doing wrong to somebody or other, better to do it to somebody who deserves it. We can assume that your friend is a good member of your community and deserves normally your cooperation. By contrast, the proprietary software developer has deliberately tried to divide you from your friends, has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community. So if you have to do wrong to your friend or the developer, do it to the developer. But being the lesser evil does not make it good. It's never good to make an agreement and then break it. Now, some kinds of agreements are inherently evil, and keeping them is worse than breaking them. This is an example. But still, breaking the agreement is not good. And if you give your friend a copy, what will she have? She will have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program. Something pretty bad. Almost as bad as an authorized copy would be. So really what you should do is make sure you never fall into the dilemma. I know of two ways. One is, don't have any friends. That's what the proprietary software developers want you to do. The other is, reject proprietary software. That's what I do. If someone offers me a program on a condition I promise not to share it with you, then no matter how convenient it would be, I reject it. I say, my conscience does not allow me to accept that condition, so take that nasty program out of here. And you should do the same thing. We should also reject the propaganda terms that against cooperation and sharing used to try to make it sound bad. Terms like, quote, pirate, unquote. When they say that if you help your neighbor, you're a pirate, what are they really trying to say? When they accuse people of copy and share of being pirates, or when they call them that, they're trying to equate helping your neighbor with attacking a ship. And morally speaking, that's as wrong as you can get, because attacking ships is very bad, but helping your neighbor is good. So we should refuse to use their twisted terminology. When people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. When they ask me what I think of software piracy or music piracy, I say, as far as I know, pirates don't use computers or play musical instruments, they use guns. So I refuse to accept their twisted meanings of these terms. You should too. Well, that's the reason for freedom number 2. Fundamental moral grounds that sharing knowledge with other people is good. Freedom 0, 1, and 3. The freedom to run the program as you wish, the freedom to study and change the source code, and the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions. Those are essential so that we can control our own computing, both individually and collectively. Freedom 0 and freedom 1 allow us to do so individually. Freedom 0 means the license of the program doesn't restrict how you can use it. Freedom 1 means the code of the program doesn't restrict how you can use it. You're free to change it if you wish, free to adapt the program to do what you wish. Otherwise, the developer is deciding what you do in your computing. And when you don't have freedom 1, the freedom to study and change the source code, you can't even tell what the program is doing. And lots of proprietary programs have malicious features. For instance, Microsoft Windows has features to spy on the user, it has features to restrict the user, and it has features to attack the user. Specific known features. The feature to attack the user is a backdoor. Well, there are several, but one is a backdoor. Microsoft can arbitrarily decide to change the software at any time, in any way, and the user has no say. So whatever malicious features it doesn't have today, it could have tomorrow. And Microsoft was once caught having installed a specific backdoor for the use of the U.S. government to spy on people in a piece of server software. But you might say Microsoft is not the only developer of proprietary software, and that's true, there are many of them. Let's consider Apple. Mac OS X has known features to restrict the user and known features to attack the user. It too has a backdoor that allows Apple to change the software in any arbitrary way at any time, and the user has no say. And these are not the only examples. Lots of cellular phones illustrate the same thing. It's common practice. What they're doing is, once they're given the unjust power that proprietary software gives them, then they try to use their power to get more power and more power, until here you see they have taken total power. You have to be crazy to trust these programs. It's a matter of blind, irrational faith. The users deny to themselves what's really going on. So sometimes people ask whether free software has good security. The fact is, proprietary software has no security. No security against the developer. And many of these developers maliciously mistreat the users. Not all, but you never know, right? You can't tell. But why do we need freedom 3? The freedom to redistribute and republish our modified versions. This is because there's so much software in the world. In fact, there's so much free software in the world that to personally study it all and master it all, and even all the programs you use, and then make all the changes you might ever want, is more work than one human being can do. So we need to work together. Freedom 3 enables us to work together. If a few people release a free program, well, and suppose we like it, but we wish for some added capabilities. Well, one person can start with this program and add part of this and release his modified version. Someone else can start with that and add more and release her version, and another group can start with that and finish the job and release their version. And then we'll say, all those people collaborated to make these improvements, and now we have what we want. And of course, this is how we get what most of us want. But if what you want is different, you're always free to change it yourself. Or if you and a certain minority group, you want something different, you together are free to change it to do the thing that you people want. So every group of people is free to work together to make the changes they want. Where we control the software collectively and individually at the same time. These 4 freedoms also are useful. Even the people who don't know how to program, the users who don't know how to program, can take advantage of these freedoms to change the software they use. Suppose that you don't know how to program, but you use a free program in your business, and you make money from using this program, but you realize your business would run better if the program were changed. Well, you can take advantage of these 4 freedoms. Here's how. You find a programmer who you think would do a good job and wants to change the program for you. Then you give a copy of the program, a copy of the version you run, to that programmer, exercising your freedom number 2 to redistribute exact copies. Then he changes the source code, exercising his freedom number 1, and then he distributes a copy of that modified source code to you, exercising his freedom number 3. And then you pay him if it works. And so this is how some of the business of free software operates. And interestingly, free software brings with it a free market for all kinds of support and services, such as this one. By contrast, proprietary software support is a monopoly. Only the developer can fix a problem, because only the developer has the source code. The users are at the mercy of this developer. And what the 4 freedoms together give us is democracy. A free program develops democratically under the control of its users. Any user is free to participate as much or as little as he wishes in society's decision about the future development of this program, which is simply the sum total of what we all decide to do with it. So it's not electoral democracy, but it's still a kind of democracy, because the users decide what the program will do. By contrast, a proprietary program develops under the dictatorship of its developer. It is meant to be an instrument to impose that developer's power on the users. So with free software, we have individual freedom, we have social solidarity, and we have democracy. With proprietary software, we have dictatorship of a developer who uses his unjust power to mistreat and exploit the users. Society must choose free software and reject proprietary That's the idea of the free software movement. The liberation of cyberspace is our goal. I came to these conclusions in 1983, and to put them into practice, I decided to write a free operating system, because the computer won't run without an operating system, so the only way users can have freedom is if there's a free operating system. So being an operating system developer, I decided to develop one. And then I decided to invite other people to help so as to finish it sooner. And then I decided to follow the design of Unix so as to make it a portable system that could run on various kinds of computers. And then I decided to make it Unix compatible so that all the Unix users could switch easily without having to relearn. And then I gave it the name GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix. It's a recursive acronym, essentially it's programmer's humor. It's a humorous way of giving Unix credit for the ideas that we got from it, but at the same time expressing the fact that this is a different system which didn't get any of its code from Unix, because the code of Unix was proprietary and we couldn't use it. To make this system lawful, we had to write every piece from scratch, and we did. So I announced this project in 1983 and started in January 1984, 25 years ago. And in 1992, Linus Torvalds had developed a kernel called Linux. And as it happens, we had all the system except the kernel. In 1992, Torvalds was not an activist for free software. He doesn't care about the user's freedom, and he says so. It's a shame, but he's entitled to his views. But he did make Linux free software, and so Linux filled the last gap in the incomplete GNU system, and made a system which was basically GNU, but also contained Linux as one important component. And this GNU/Linux system, or GNU plus Linux system, has been used ever since then. Unfortunately, today, most versions of the system are not free. There are hundreds or thousands of different versions of the GNU/Linux system, and most of them contain non-free programs also. And here you can see the big weakness of our community. Lots of people like the software, but they have never thought about the ethical issues I've mentioned to you today. And they've never even heard these issues, because they've only heard about open source. And what is open source? Open source is a term that was coined 10 years ago by the people who liked the GNU/Linux system, but didn't want to raise the issue of freedom. They didn't want to criticize anything and say, they didn't want to say anything was unethical. They didn't want to rock the boat. They wanted to appeal above all to business, and they had the model that business people are amoral and they don't want to hear you say that anything is wrong. So they decided not to say that anything is wrong. And so they constructed an amoral kind of discourse about the issue. Well, they have a right to their views. That's not what I stand for. That's why I don't want my events to be open source events, because that's a viewpoint I disagree with. There are articles that have been published in reputable newspapers that called me the father of open source. And I wrote letters to the editor, and I said, if I'm the father of open source, it must have been done using artificial insemination with purloined sperm without my permission. Anyway, so now you understand what free software is and what the issues are. So once the GNU/Linux system started to catch on in the 90s, I got invited to give more speeches about free software. And at the end of the speech, people would often ask, do these ideas apply to anything else besides software? Like, what about hardware? Should chairs be free, and computers, and microphones, and cars? Well, if I had a car, I would not object if somebody, while my car was parked, walked up with his car copier and connected one end to my car and out the other end grew a copy. And then eventually he could, I hope it would have a different lock. Because then eventually he should then pick up his car copier, get into the copy and drive away. And I wouldn't mind at all. But these car copiers don't exist. We don't have chair copiers or microphone copiers or computer copiers. In India they have chair copiers. They're human. And table copiers. So the freedom to copy chairs and tables is a real issue in India. But no one in the world has a computer copier. So the question of whether we're free to copy our computers or our cars or our microphones is a meaningless question. And the people who asked me the question in that form, they were being wise guys. They were being silly. But, and what about the freedom to modify physical objects? Well, which would correspond to freedom one, the freedom to study and change the source code of a program. The physical object has no source code. So you have to adapt the idea of freedom one. It could become the freedom to study and change the object itself. Well, the answer is you have that freedom, generally. Almost always, nobody's stopping you. It's just that the ability to do so is rather limited. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So physical objects usually are as free as they could meaningfully be, in this sense of freedom. But the place where the question is meaningful is for other kinds of information works that you could have a copy of in your computer, and then you can change them and you can copy them, because the computer will do that. So the question of whether you are allowed to do so is a real question, and it has become an important political issue of our time. And that is the subject of this talk, which I can now finally begin. Now, proprietary software is made proprietary in a number of ways. Partly using copyright law, but more using contracts, and partly just by withholding the source code. And there are other methods like TiVoization, where they design the machine so it refuses to run modified programs. That should be illegal. But in any case, there are many ways that they make programs proprietary. But if you have a copy of something that is meant for humans to observe, or read, or listen to, or watch, then if it's not free, in almost all cases, the only reason is copyright law. Copyright law is the only thing that would restrict what you do with most published works that are not software. So, we can restate the same question from the other direction. Instead of asking what you should be free to do, we can ask, what should copyright law say? They're the same question viewed from two sides. Now, copyright law evolved with copying technology, so it's useful to look at the history of copying technology and of copyright law. Now, changes in technology can't affect basic moral principles. But when we apply our moral principles to a specific question, we do it by looking at the consequences of various possible choices. And then we judge those consequences. So, changes in the context can change the consequences of an act, and thus make it more good or more bad. For instance, if we could reliably resurrect the dead, then killing somebody wouldn't matter much. You'd say, oh, you killed him, we sentence you to pay for his new body. It's not a big deal. And we would all get uninsured killer insurance. At least in the U.S. Maybe here the government would simply pay for that and make everything simple. So, copying began in the ancient world, where it was done, well, in most countries with a pen on a writing surface. Basically, you read one copy of the book and you wrote another. Now, this technology was not very efficient, but it had certain other interesting consequences. First of all, no economy of scale. To make 10 copies, basically you had to make one copy 10 times. And it took 10 times as long. Another consequence was it required no special skills beyond literacy itself. And another consequence was, another fact about this technology was no special equipment was required other than the equipment for writing anything. The result was a decentralized system of copies. Anywhere that there was a copy of a book and someone else wanted to make one more, he could do so. And he would do so. And that's how copies were made. And in the ancient world, there was nothing like copyright. So if you had a copy of a book and you wanted to make another, then nobody tried to stop you or ever thought of stopping you, except if the local ruler didn't like what the book said, in which case he might put you in prison or kill you or whatever. Now, this was not quite the same thing as copyright. This was censorship, which is closely related to copyright. But then, anyway, that was the situation in the ancient world. But then there was a big advance in copying technology, the printing press, which made it possible to make many identical copies very efficiently. So the printing press made copying more efficient, but not uniformly so, because it only was effective for certain cases, certain situations, certain scenarios of copying. Because the printing press was only useful for mass production. It takes a long time to set the type. But once you have set the type, you can make many identical pages fast. So, the printing press made mass production copying a lot more efficient, but had no effect on the efficiency of making one copy, because for that the most efficient way was to write it by hand. Still, the printing press also printing press technology required expensive special equipment, the press and the type. Most people who knew how to read and write did not have a printing press. Also, it required special skills. Knowing how to write did not mean you knew how to run a printing press. I suppose it wasn't rocket science, but still it was something most literate people didn't know. So the result was a centralized system of production where copies of any given book would be mass-produced in a few places, and then they would be transported from each place to where people might want to buy them. Copyright began in the age of the printing press. For instance, copyright in England began in the 1500s as a system of censorship. Anyone that wanted to print a book had to ask for permission from the Crown. And this permission was a monopoly granted to one publisher, a perpetual monopoly. In any case, this system of censorship was eliminated in the late 1600s after a revolution. But then copyright was introduced as a system to encourage publication. And this is when copyrights were given to authors. And they were given for a limited time. a fairly short time at first. I can't remember whether it was something like 14 years. So it was there around that range. And so the idea developed that copyright was meant to benefit society. It wasn't for the sake of these authors who were given the copyrights. Rather, it was a way to modify their behavior so that they would do things that were good for society, such as write and publish. When the U.S. Constitution was written, there was a proposal that authors be given an entitlement to a copyright. This was rejected, although you'd never believe it to hear what publishers say, but it was rejected. Instead, the U.S. Constitution authorizes Congress to establish a copyright system if it wishes. And if there is a copyright system, it's supposed to exist for the purpose of promoting progress, which is a public benefit, not a benefit for authors. And it has to last for a limited time. So perpetual copyright is unconstitutional in the U.S. The movie companies want perpetual copyright, but they can't get it officially. In the age of the printing press, copyright functioned as an industrial regulation. It restricted publishers, which were certain businesses. It did not restrict readers. The things a reader could do were not covered by copyright. So it was an industrial regulation on publishers, controlled by authors, and all set up in order to benefit the general public. This made it uncontroversial, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial. It was uncontroversial since the readers were not being restricted. They had no reason to complain, and they didn't. It was easy to enforce because it only had to be enforced against certain specialized businesses, the publishers. And it's easy to find who's publishing and selling books. You don't have to invade everybody's home and computer to do that. And it was arguably beneficial for the public because the public traded away the freedom to copy books, which the public couldn't do anyway, since ordinary citizens didn't have printing presses. And in exchange, they received the benefit of more writing, more books that you could read that were for sale in the bookstores, and more conversation about important issues that could help society. So, if this were the age of the printing press, I wouldn't be complaining about copyright. But the age of the printing press is gradually giving way to the age of the computer networks, another advance in copying technology, which once again makes copying more efficient. And once again, not uniformly so. Because here's what we had in the age of the printing press. Mass production, much more efficient because of the printing press, but one-at-a-time copying meant writing it over again by hand. Digital technology makes things more efficient and not uniformly so. It gives us this. It makes mass production copying somewhat more efficient, and it's a tremendous benefit for one-at-a-time copying. One-at-a-time copying is now almost as efficient as mass production. Not quite, not perfectly so, but almost. One-at-a-time copying is something our computers are very good at. So the result is a situation more like the ancient world, where everyone who can use the work can also copy it, and finds it very useful to copy it, and now wants to copy it. So copyright, even without any change in the text of copyright law, was transformed by this technological advance into a restriction on the ordinary public. It's no longer functioning as an industrial regulation on publishers controlled by the authors with the benefits going to the public. Now it's a restriction on the public controlled by the publishers and usually only in the name of the authors. And the reason is that the publishers systematically, in all the various media, have managed to impose their power over the authors. So the power is created in the name of the author, but in most cases it's really the publisher who wields the power over the public. As a result, it's no longer uncontroversial, no longer easy to enforce, and no longer beneficial. It's no longer uncontroversial because we can all copy now, and we want to copy, and there they are telling us that it's forbidden. It's no longer easy to enforce because now it has to be enforced against each and every citizen, and to do that they require draconian punishments. In the UK, there was a proposal to imprison people for 10 years for non-commercially sharing, for helping their neighbors. And there are proposals to monitor everybody's use of the network. Several countries have adopted laws that punish people for being accused without trial, like France and New Zealand. And this is proposed for the European Union, showing essentially how much the European Union is the tool of businesses that want to attack your freedom. And it's no longer beneficial. In the age of the printing press, we traded away theoretical freedoms that we were unable to exercise, so we lost nothing, and in exchange, we got benefits of more books being written. Well, that's a good trade. If you trade away something you can't use, you have lost nothing. But now we can use those freedoms. Now they are not worthless. Now they are important to us. And that trade has become a bad one. So a democratic government would say, we can no longer trade away these freedoms on behalf of our citizens. We have to give these freedoms back to our citizens. Maybe we can trade away part of it, but not as much as we did in the past, because some of these freedoms are now important and the citizens must have them. Of course, that's the exact opposite of what governments are really doing around the world. And we can use this to measure how undemocratic most governments are. And they're doing the exact opposite of what would benefit their citizens because they are under the control of business. So, for instance, there's a worldwide movement to extend copyright, to make copyright last longer, and to extend the power of copyright so that the power forbids more things. The movie companies want perpetual copyright. In the US, at least, they can't get perpetual copyright. So they came up with another idea. Perpetual copyright on the installment plan. Every 20 years, they're going to extend copyright by 20 more years. This was done last in 1998. You see, Disney noticed that the copyright on Mickey Mouse was going to expire. Because Mickey Mouse, the character, first appeared in the film Steamboat Willie in 1929. And the copyright on that film was going to expire in a few years, and then people would be able to copy the images from that film, including the image of Mickey Mouse as he was drawn then. Well, Disney wants to have a monopoly forever, so Disney and likewise other companies paid our Congress to extend this law. In the U.S., laws are for sale in Congress. The system is totally corrupt, and yet it's not the kind of corruption, usually not, where the congressman secretly takes a payment. So it's not illegal. Instead, they get rewards such as they get hired after they leave office, or they start a law firm or a consulting business, and they get, and the clients who they gave laws to will do business with them. So they get a reward, but not in a form that can be prosecuted. But nonetheless, the system is totally corrupt. So they extended copyright by 20 years for both future works and past works. Now, I don't know how they can convince the now dead authors of the 1920s and 30s to write more back then by giving them 20 more years of copyright now. If they have a time machine, apparently they didn't use it, because our history books do not say that authors were delighted in the 1920s when they discovered they would get 20 more years of copyright. Unfortunately, this means they won't get to hear my recommendations. Now, theoretically, 20 more years of copyright for future works could mean more incentive for people to make works. But economists will tell you that the discounted value of 20 more years of copyright a century or so in the future is so small that it's not rationally going to persuade anybody to do anything. The reason for that law was simply to extend the power that the publishers have over the old works. And the extension of copyright for future works was just an excuse. And so I suppose in 2018 they'll pass another law to extend it all 20 more years, unless we can stop them. But even worse is what they're planning to do to the breadth of copyright, because copyright in the age of the printing press was never conceived as covering all uses of a copyrighted work. The uses restricted by copyright were an exception within a broader space of unregulated uses that anyone was free to do. But the publishers have the idea that they can use digital technology to seize total control. They want a pay-per-read universe, or pay-per-view, pay-per-listen, whatever. They want to have total power over what people can do with published works. And they're trying to do this with digital restrictions management, or DRM. Boy, I'm sad they had to leave before they heard this. Digital restrictions management is the practice of designing products to restrict the user. Specifically, publishing works in encrypted form, and then designing the players for that encrypted format so that they restrict the users. DVDs are a good example. The video in a DVD is usually in encrypted form, And there are certain authorized DVD players that can decrypt it, and they are all designed to restrict the user all the same way. The reason is that this is required by the DVD conspiracy, which is a group of companies that said anyone that wants to make a DVD player has to sign a contract with us promising to keep the format secret and promising to build their DVD players to restrict the user just like all the other DVD players. So all the authorized DVD players are made by companies which signed this contract, and that's why they all restrict the user the same. And well, I'll take questions at the end. And so initially the format was supposed to be secret, but people figured it out, and they wrote free software back in the 90s that could play a DVD. And thus it was possible to put a DVD into your computer, which was running the free GNU/Linux system, and actually watch the video. Well, the movie companies didn't like that, so they made this software illegal. They censored it. The United States was the first country. Now the European Union does it too, and the U.S. has imposed similar requirements on various other countries. Now, you might ask, how do I know about this conspiracy? The answer is, because it's not secret. They boast about what they're doing. Now, for companies to conspire to restrict the public's access to technology ought to be a serious crime. They ought to be prosecuted for this. The executive should go to prison, just as they would go to prison if they conspired to restrict commerce in some other way, like by fixing prices. But in fact, our governments are on their side against us. And these companies are so confident that nobody will prosecute them for these conspiracies that they don't even bother to keep it a secret. Despite the system of censorship, the free software to play DVDs is widely available. So, and they know this. They know they'll never be able to make that software go away. So, they've developed a new scheme for digital restrictions management, which is called AACS, or the ACS. And it's used in Blu-ray discs, which is why you should not buy or use Blu-ray discs at all. But in general, you must never willingly give up your freedom. So you must never accept any product with digital restrictions management unless you personally have the means to break the handcuffs and access the data. So if you have the free software that can decrypt the DVD, then it's okay to use DVDs. Otherwise, you should reject them. Well, at least you should reject the encrypted DVDs, because there are a few which are not encrypted. So you should check them before you buy them. Now, we have seen digital restrictions management appear in other areas as well. For instance, about a decade ago, we started to see things that looked like compact discs of music, but they didn't follow the specifications of a CD. So we call them corrupt discs. In fact, they had been mismanufactured intentionally to stop people from reading them in a computer. And in some countries in Europe, they are required to label them. They can't say this is a compact disc because it isn't made following the standard. And so instead they say copy control. I once gave this speech in another part of Europe, and my host afterward gave me some books and some music records about their region. And one of these records looked really interesting, so I wanted to open it up and listen to it. But fortunately, before I opened it, I saw that it said copy control. This disc can be played in Windows and Macintosh systems. In other words, only with proprietary software, which I refused to have on my computer because it was a corrupt disc. So I gave it back and I said, here you see the face of the enemy. Please take this back to the store because they don't deserve to keep your money. Now, I've never heard that music, but that's okay. I won't give up my freedom for something like that. Well, Sony got in a lot of trouble for its corrupt discs. A few years ago, Sony developed a scheme for corrupt discs where if you put it into the computer, then some software on the disk got installed into the computer. And this system was like the software that a cracker uses to take control of the system. It installed itself into the system where it prevented the system from, it imposed restrictions on access to that disk. But it also did other things. For instance, it changed other commands in the system to disguise its own presence and to interfere with attempts to delete it, just like a virus. And now this is a felony, a serious crime, to do this to people's computers without asking them. But to make it even worse, this software also damaged the security of the system. What security it had, because we're talking about Windows here. And in addition, it was also infringement of copyright because it contained code that had been previously released under the GNU General Public License, and where they failed to follow the conditions which say that you must give the user the source code of the whole containing program, and you must give the user a copy of the license itself so that he knows his rights. Sony didn't do that. Well, commercial copyright infringement, that's a serious crime also. Of course, Sony was never prosecuted because the U.S. government is on the side of businesses against the public and understood full well that these laws were meant to help business against citizens, not help citizens against business. But people sued Sony. Unfortunately, the public condemnation of Sony focused not on the evil purpose of this, which was to restrict users who were listening to music, but instead only on the secondary nasty things that Sony did in order to achieve that evil purpose. So they made a settlement with Sony in which Sony promised that in the future, when it tried to restrict computer users, it would not do the other nasty things. In other words, the settlement only addressed side issues and did nothing to solve the underlying problem. And Sony has learned its lesson. In the future, this so-called rootkit to attack your computer will be installed before you get it, and it will be impossible to remove, and it will be the axe. And this is what's already being done in the PlayStation 3, which is a very nasty product that no one should get. Because it's designed to attack your freedom. It's impossible to use it except giving up your freedom. So don't use it. You can, but you can't get full access to the facilities of the machine because the digital restrictions management is still operating. I suspect, by the way, that they didn't install Linux. They installed the GNU plus Linux operating system. And by calling it Linux, they're giving all the credit to Mr. Torvalds, who, just like coincidence, is not an advocate of your freedom. Coincidence or maybe not. And then we started to see digital restrictions management on books. About 8 years ago, there was a big commercial publicity campaign in faith trying to convince us all to read books online. And of course, these eBooks online usually come with digital restrictions management. So really, the publishers were trying to establish their pay-per-read universe, and they had a two-phase plan to do it. They wanted to take away traditional freedoms of readers to do things such as borrow a book from the public library, or sell a book to a used bookstore, or lend a book to a friend, or buy a book anonymously by paying cash. Even the freedom to keep a book for as long as you want and read it as many times as you want and pass it on eventually to your heirs who can also read it. They want to take away all those freedoms. But they figured that if they explicitly tried to abolish those freedoms, they would get too much opposition, at least in the U.S. The European Union is more anti-democratic than the U.S. government, and they have been able to explicitly take away some of those freedoms here. But, so since they didn't think they could get all of this power directly, they worked out a two-stage plan to get the same result. First, take away all these freedoms for eBooks. And there they didn't face much resistance because there were no eBooks and nobody was reading them, and so nobody thought about the issue except a few of us activists. So that's what they did in the U.S. in 1998 with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and in the European Union with the Copyright Directive of about 5 years ago. Well, then the second stage was convince people to stop using paper books and read eBooks, and that meant give up your freedom. Well, that stage failed. People just didn't read eBooks. They didn't want to. One company had the idea that they could make their line of eBooks a success with the people who love technology by starting it with my biography. So they found an author and sent him to me, and he asked if I would cooperate with his writing a biography of me that would be published as an ebook, restricting the users. This happens to me over and over again, that in my activities to promote my cause, I am faced with the choice of either acting ethically in accord with the cause or being a hypocrite. And people are often surprised and shocked when I decide to act in accord with the views I have stated. And when I don't agree to throw away my ethical principles just so that more people will see what I said. But that would be self-defeating. If I don't live by my views, what good is it to say them to people? It would be useless. So I said to him, no, I will only cooperate if this ebook is published without encryption. And he went back to the publisher who refused to do that. So I suggested a different publisher who said yes. And thus the book was written and published, although it has a number of important errors. especially in chapter 11. But in fact, that book is free. It's published with the 4 freedoms. You can publish your modified version if you want. Anyway, eBooks mostly failed. People just didn't want to read books on a screen. But it wasn't that people were attached to their freedom and refused to give it up. So I said they're going to try again. And now they are. Sony and Amazon make ebook readers that are designed to attack your freedom. There is the Sony Shredder. Well, they call it the Sony Reader, but I'd rather put the on the front. And there is the Amazon Swindle. And these products are designed to tempt you into betraying all your friends. Because if you stop lending books to your friends, they're not your friends anymore, obviously. So spread the word. Nobody should use products like these under any circumstances. Nobody should get them. Don't get any product designed to attack your freedom. And don't get any product with DRM unless you have the means to break the DRM. Now, to fight in a more organized way against DRM, because it's after all, it's conspiracies of come amount we pay won't be so big. It won't be 1,000 times this, it'll only be 10 times this, or 11. No, he doesn't, it's not his freedom. Getting money is not a freedom. Oh, you could do surveys. That is, you don't check what everybody's doing. That would intrude on everybody's privacy. But it's easy enough to measure popularity with surveys.
Yeah, but
and most people would happily participate in the surveys when they're paid. And I would.
Of course, but it won't help new artists to start. It won't.
Well, the current system doesn't really help them much anyway. They're the ones who are getting trampled by the record companies.
Yeah, but it's helping them because they can make their first CD.
Well, it's not that hard to do that anymore. They don't need that the way they needed it 20 years ago. And increasingly, musicians are rejecting the record company system, realizing that it's just going to exploit them and hurt them. And that's the other method I wanted to talk about, which is voluntary payments. Musicians are starting to discover that voluntary payments work. For instance, a couple of famous groups, Radiohead and 9 Inch Nails, released records and essentially said, you can pay if you want. They released records on the internet, and they said you could pay if you want. And they got hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then there are others who are not so famous. There's a Canadian singer whose name I keep forgetting because I've never heard of her in terms of music. I only heard of her as, Jane Siberry. I only heard of her because she distributes her music through her website, and she lets people pay as much as they wish or not. And on the average, she gets more per download in voluntary payments than the major record companies charge. So by letting people pay if they wish, she gets more per person. Now, the main obstacle to the convenient functioning of this system is its inconvenience. You have to have a credit card. There are a lot of people who don't have credit cards. And not only that, it's not anonymous, which is nasty. When I buy a CD, I pay cash and nobody knows what I bought. And I don't want anyone checking everything I do. You know, I'd be happy to answer a survey because, you know, especially if the survey is done anonymously, which it should be. And if there was ever anything I didn't want Big Brother to know about, I could leave it out. But paying with a credit card and having everything I buy recorded, that's not good. So we need some sort of anonymous digital cash system to make it trivially painless to send some money to some artists whenever you like their work.
There was one that was before.
Was there such a system? Did it require people to have a credit card?
No.
Well, then the next question is, what did you have to do to sign up? I'd be interested in finding out, because I suspect the reason it failed was the work you had to do to participate was too much of an obstacle and it discouraged people. But, you know, if you show me the facts, I'll have to see what conclusion they draw.
I don't remember exactly, but it was a system called eCash, and it was quite famous some years ago.
I never heard of it.
Neither me.
So, the more people use the net, the better these voluntary payments will work. They're already working basically well enough. So, we don't have to feel attached to the existing copyright system, which has been captured by the publishers, so that aside from superstars, the artists actually barely receive anything. We can make the system serve its purpose better by changing it to respect our freedom. So, since I spoke extensively on the free software topic at the beginning, I'm going to present my other identity. Now, I would like to suggest that if you are here from the press photographing, that you not provide a photo of St. Ignatius, because after 2 hours of talk, you understand I have some serious ideas, even if I give you some comic relief. But if that's the first thing people see, they won't quite they'll be misled. Anyway, Emacs started out as a text editor, which became a way of life for many users, because it was an extensible text editor, and people extended it so much that the users could do all their computing work without ever exiting Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs. Today in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several rival versions of Emacs, and we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we worship an editor. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. In the Church of Emacs, we have a religious ceremony called the Fubar Mitzvah, in which a new hacker, perhaps of 13 years old, stands in front of other hackers and recites important parts of the system's source code. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs. The Virgin of Emacs is any woman who has not yet learned how to use Emacs. Taking her Emacs virginity is considered to be a blessed act of Emacs. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches that I won't mention. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you have been searching for a church to be saintly in, you might want to consider ours. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever evil proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your use, and then install a wholly free operating system. And then only install free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you too will have the right to wear a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me whether in the Church of Emacs the use of the other editor VI is a sin. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you very much. So now I would like to answer questions. And there is an interpreter available in case someone wants to ask a question in Polish. By the way, when you speak, if you're speaking English to me, please speak loud and slowly because I'm a bit hard of hearing.
Are you able, as one of the biggest experts, able to recommend the best?
I'm afraid I can't hear you very well. Please pronounce your concept.
Recommendation of the best Linux right now to use in case of the community of the forward global with standards like Konrad, European Union.
You mean which which free programs are most convenient?
If you can recommend with the pure, so the best Linux to use.
Sorry, the best Linux? You mean the best distribution of GNU/Linux? Because Linux by itself won't run. Linux is one component of an operating system, but it won't run by itself. If you install Linux alone, it's useless. You need the rest of the system also. And that's GNU plus Linux. Now, from my point of view, I can only recommend the distributions which are entirely free software. And they include GNU Sense and Ututo, U-T-U-T-O, and Blag, and Treeskel. The list is in GNU.org. You don't need to write it down. Look at GNU.org and you can find the list of free GNU/Linux distributions. It's not. Debian, first of all, its servers have the non-free section and the contrib section, which promotes a lot of non-free programs. And also, in Debian's version of Linux, the kernel, there is non-free software. You see, Torvalds, the developer of Linux, has never been in favor of defending users' freedom. And some years ago, he began allowing non-free programs to be put into the source code of Linux. And some of them are not even really source code. They're disguised as source code. They're actually executable programs in the form of a long series of numbers. So in free distros, we have to get rid of those. The free BSD license is a free software license, and it's compatible with the GNU GPL. If you want to use it, it's not wrong. But it's not as good in terms of protecting the user's freedom as the GNU General Public License or GNU GPL. I'm not interested in opening or closing source. Those are terms that refer to open source, which is an idea I disagree with. Now, I also disagree completely with what you said. The freedom does not include the freedom to subjugate others. I'm sorry. That's not part of my definition of freedom. In fact, that is a stratagem to destroy the meaning of the word freedom. By saying you're not free unless you can enslave others, they're rejecting freedom. Now that license doesn't mistreat anybody, so it's okay. But it fails to defend freedom, so it's not the best license you can use.
You issued some theory that in ancient Egypt or ancient times there was no copyright. But it started were a copyright because there was some group of men that, you know, the ability to write was uncommon.
Yeah.
They made special alphabet, what was quite difficult, and to participate in this group, you have to have good connection. Okay?
Well, that's not the same as copyright. That was social classes, and it was an unjust system, but it's not the same. We should be careful not to equate all kinds of injustice as if they were the same.
But my point is that it's very human thing to use information or knowledge to enslave the other.
Yes, that's a very general description, and it has been done in many ways.
But isn't this fight with the windmills?
Well, that's a non sequitur if I ever heard one. The free software movement has been quite effective, and if we change copyright law to permit sharing and so on, then we'll have that freedom too. I don't know why you're trying to presume defeat. I agree it's going to be a hard fight, but meanwhile free software is succeeding quite well.
What is your recommendation for the transition period if we imagine that the current software industry leaders met somewhere and said, okay, let's open everything up?
Well, I'm not in favor of opening things up. I'm in favor of freeing them.
Yes. Let's free everything, say, Steve Ballmer with Ariel Ellison and the kind. How do you think this could be achieved from the state as it is now to the state that...
I don't know. I mean, I would have to talk with them about it, right? If they were willing to do this, the details would be a matter to negotiate with them. I think about this question because it doesn't seem to be a likely circumstance. Now, sometimes some developers have decided to make some programs free, and they do it the way they want to do it.
But, I mean, is there a way to convert the current software industry to a free state?
Well, most of the current software industry is basically there already, because most of it is developing custom software that's being paid for by somebody who's going to use it. And that doesn't require much change. I'm not interested in closed or open. I don't advocate making things open, and what I'm against is not closed. Please don't ask me to participate in discussions about open source, because I'm against that idea. Well, you're stupid if you pay somebody to write a program and you don't demand the source code. And the thing is, you're stupid if you don't demand the source code. And I have no sympathy with companies that mistreat their clients. But even distributing the source code, the client will still have to pay them to write the program, so the business will still be the same. And the other thing is, overall, it's not really going to change the price, because it doesn't change the amount of work to be done. Or it may somewhat reduce the amount of work to be done. Sometimes, instead of paying somebody to write a program, you could pay somebody to adapt a free program, and that will cost you less, because it's less work. No matter how they twist this around, when you're talking about custom software development, making it less work or more efficient is going to reduce the price. Well, tough. Who cares? I mean, these are minor details. Well, we have to fight then. Join in the fight.